women started to play a really strong role within the Kurdish movement itself and came to the forefront more so maybe than in other armed liberation struggles. And that meant that this movement kind of came to a realization that even if they could establish an independent socialist Kurdish state, that state would probably repeat the same forms of oppression that they had experienced living in a nominally socialist Syrian state or a nominally socialist Iraqi state, but that actually continued to repress its people. And so what they said was they wanted to fight instead for a federation, a democratic federation, one which sees that before you can liberate your people, the very first step you have to take is to liberate women. Women have to be at the forefront of that struggle.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Matt Broomfield. Matt is a freelance journalist, a PhD researcher, co-founder of the Rojava Information Center, and the author of Hope Without Hope, Rojava and Revolutionary Commitment. Matt has spent his career investigating and studying the Kurdish movement in northern Syria, an extraordinary political project in the heart of the Middle East, founded on politics of anarchy, feminism, and liberation, which came to self-govern a territory the size of Lebanon. In this extraordinary episode, Matt explains how Rojava came to be from 1917 right up until January 2026, explaining the geopolitics at the beginning of the 20th century that created the biggest stateless population in the world, and how that very statelessness then informed their political agenda, and how that political agenda of self-determination, self-governance, equality, and women's liberation found its opportunity during the Syrian civil war, alongside explaining the history and the actualities, because since Assad's government in Syria fell, Rojava has come under political attack from all sides. He also offers what leftist and liberation movements around the world can learn from Rojava, from the contradictions and compromises that they had to make in order to retain their autonomy, the practical and ideological difficulties of governing large territories of diverse ethnicities, and above all, the vision that was propelling them to make difficult decisions, do the daily administrative grind, and also take up arms to defend the belief that another world is possible. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at www.planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Matt, welcome to Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
I feel very fortunate to have you and your particular area of expertise given everything that's going on in Syria at the moment and the Middle East more broadly. But before we dive into, and long before we dive into sort of what has recently happened in Syria with the change of power and how that's affecting the local populations, I'd love if we could just go back probably about 20 years. So you could give me and the audience sort of a feeling for the civil war, what kicked off the civil war, and how this autonomous zone of Rojava really came into being from that. So if you could take us back to 2011, Matt.
If I could just very briefly take us back to 1917.
Oh, great.
Just very briefly. But I think to sort of, I'm going to be speaking about today is a Kurdish political project in Syria, and what people may well know about the Kurdish people is that they are one of the world's largest people without a state of their own. numbering maybe some 40 million. There's never been an independent Kurdistan. And instead, following World War I in 1917, that region was divided up by the imperial powers, by Britain, surprise, surprise, and by France. And the homeland of these 40 million Kurdish people who speak Kurdish and have their kind of own cultural identity was divided up between 4 modern states: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And that has sort of set the precedent for what's happened to the Kurds for the past 100 years. They've met with different forms of violence, in all those countries, very repressed and denied the right to speak their own language. In Turkey, subjected to genocide. In Saddam Hussein's Iraq, also executed, repressed, marginalized in Iran. And the same is true for Syria, where at the start of the Syrian revolution, 2011, there were about 2 million Kurds living, but again, kind of marginalized, often not allowed their own identity papers, not allowed to speak their own language in public, and jailed, tortured, killed for their political activity. So then there was this opening that developed in the course of the Syrian revolution. So the Syrian revolution was part of this broader global wave of protests, really, that we know linked to the global financial crisis. So Occupy, for example, in Britain, protests in Latin America, Eastern Europe, in Hong Kong, all over the world, but especially in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, where people rose up against their sort of dictators and said that they wanted a fairer economic settlement, and they wanted particularly more democratic rights, the right to participate more fully in political life, to, not suffer those forms of repression, to have a free media, and so on and so on. That also happened in Syria. There was an uprising against the dictator there, Bashar al-Assad, along those lines. But as people probably know, that uprising, like most of the other Arab Spring uprisings, didn't kind of result in the people successfully storming the palace and creating a new democratic system. So yeah, these sort of protests that occurred, all over the world, and especially in the Middle East, generally didn't achieve their aims. And throughout the Middle East, they were sort of met with, repression, violent repression on the one hand, and on the other hand, the protest movements themselves being taken over by more authoritarian, often Islamist forces. And that's kind of what happened in Syria. For there was this uprising, but very quickly there was very violent repression by the Assad regime that created a lot of problems for the broader Syrian opposition. It rapidly became a military conflict. Islamist forces, often sponsored by foreign powers, sort of took control of that fight, and various foreign powers entered and started sponsoring those. Meanwhile, there was this Kurdish project going on within Syria as well. So yeah, as I said, these protests, or we call them the Arab Spring, right? And maybe you can see that, for the Kurdish people, there was already an issue because, although they live in the Middle East, although they're subject to the same forms of repression, they're not Arabs, and they have their own kind of culture and their own identity. And so within Syria, for example, the Kurdish people took advantage of this crisis to start advancing their own claims for autonomy, based on their sort of unique ideology that maybe we'll talk about in a moment. So somehow, at times clashing with Assad, the dictator, at times also fighting with the rest of the Syrian opposition. And that was particularly as the Syrian opposition became more and more Islamist in nature. The Kurdish forces started fighting with them, and that culminated in the Kurdish war against ISIS in Syria, which sort of really set the tone for the rest of the conflict.
Wow, fascinating. It's me. I had no idea that there were 40 million Kurds who were stateless. I like to think I'm, relatively well read on the different forms of oppression that are going on in the world, certainly the big ones. And it's not really something that crosses our headlines all that often, really. And I have been surprised as I've been I was a mid-teenager when the Arab Spring happened. So I've been surprised as I've gotten older to learn about the sort of the transformation in the northern part of Syria and this sort of Kurdish democratic socialist feminist breakthrough. And also how little attention really that's gotten as well, where pretty much all of the focus was on the the opposition and Assad, and obviously the imperial powers and who they were backing. So I think now would be a really good time. What is it about what came to be known as Rojava that is completely outstanding relative not just to neighboring political systems in the Middle East, but really almost anywhere in the world?
Yeah, so as I said, the Kurdish people, they've never had a state of their own, and that has meant that Kurdish politics has kind of taken a different direction to other politics in the region. And, there are other peoples in the region fighting for their right to self-determination. But sort of the form that has taken in terms of the Kurdish political movement is unique. So at one point, earlier in the 20th century, the Kurds were, fighting for an independent socialist Kurdish state, like other anti-colonial movements throughout the world, but they came to change that approach. I think, for a number of reasons, maybe most of all because they recognized they weren't going to get that state. They were living under this imperial system. It wasn't practical for them to believe that the imperial powers would allow them to achieve that goal. Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan was at that time started reading, sort of different, other thinkers from more feminist, more anarchist traditions. And also women started to play a really strong role within the Kurdish movement itself and came to the forefront more so maybe than in other armed liberation struggles. And that meant that this movement kind of came to a realization that even if they could establish an independent socialist Kurdish state, that state would probably repeat the same forms of oppression that they had experienced living in a nominally socialist Syrian state or a nominally socialist Iraqi state, but that actually continued to repress its people. And so what they said was they wanted to fight instead for a federation, a democratic federation, one which sees that before you can liberate your people, the very first step you have to take is to liberate women. Women have to be at the forefront of that struggle. And secondarily, that rather than just creating a new independent state, what you have to do, or what they would say that they're seeking to do, is to create a federation which allows people to govern themselves in their own communities, in their own cities, their own neighborhoods, their own villages. And that was this new kind of political vision that they came up with and that developed particularly throughout the 1990s, 2000s, and they continued their fights, especially against Turkey, but saying now, okay, this is our goal, this is what we want to build. And they've been trying to build that in different ways, in different places, in refugee camps that they control in the Iraqi desert, for example, in the sort of guerrilla bases that they have in the Iraqi mountains, trying to build that also within sort of civil society, among these conditions of repression that exist in the region. But where they really got the chance to start trying to do that for the first time on a big scale was in Syria. So the fact of this Syrian crisis, that this military outbreak, meant that Assad's armed forces left this region called Rojava, which is the Kurdish majority regions of Syria. And that created a power vacuum, and the Kurdish militants were able to take control of that area and start trying to implement some of these ideas, not just on the level of a few thousand committed revolutionaries as they had been beforehand, but to govern a territory which, grew to encompass as large as maybe 5 million people. Throughout the whole of the northeast. So that was kind of the project. And when people speak about the Rojava Revolution, this is what they're trying to do, to create society which was governed in a different way, which had a leading role for women, and which didn't repeat the sort of authoritarian repression that was present under Assad. How that went is a different story, but I think we'll speak about that in due course.
Let's talk about some of the practicalities of liberating women first, of that being the prerequisite really for a liberatory political formation to emerge. What did that mean practically beyond putting women in positions of power?
So this idea, as I said, developed through sort of over the decades within the Kurdish movement, and I suppose it began really it began with the armed struggle, and you get that originally, this was and is a militant movement, a guerrilla movement, and that women started joining that movement in large numbers, and facing a lot of, I suppose, internal challenges within that movement, as you would imagine, as people who've been involved in any kind of activist organizing anywhere in the world will know. It could be difficult for women to make their voices heard, and to participate, and that's especially so in a society like Kurdish society, which is very conservative, very religious, very traditional society in a very poor part of the Middle East. And so women had to fight hard within that movement to say, we want this kind of autonomy, we want our own armed forces as a sort of guarantee that we're able to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves against these states that are trying to repress us, but also against the internal challenges that we're trying to face. We want a place where we can go to, where we know if we're facing forced marriage, if we're facing abuse at home, we can go, we can be just with women. Women will protect us. Women will resolve these issues between women. And that kind of, on the one hand, that kind of model of autonomy that began in the armed forces then kind of spread throughout society. And they now seek to have, these sort of all-female, for any institution, there will also be an all-female equivalent. And within the male a sort of general institution, there will always be sort of joint male and female participation. I don't know. So, for example, you will have in a governing council, there will always be one man and one woman who are the most senior people. Then there will also be an all-female council that's not answerable. And that's true again, in the field of media, for example, the field of justice, there's a special women's law to which women are only answerable.
Wow.
And so on and so on. Of course, and to them, it's sort of all of that is sort of conceptualized as forms of self-defense. The self-defense isn't just about having a gun in your hand, although they see that as a sort of non-negotiable, but it's also about having the ability to determine your own situation and your own future kind of as women, and to live sort of as women, as free from male influence as possible. That's the idea. Of course, this vision, meets with a lot of challenges. That's particularly been so in the course of the Rojava projects, because I think it's kind of one thing, you have these sort of thousands and thousands of women who are living this way as sort of, committed revolutionaries and trying, although, not without its own issues, but trying to just organize their own affairs, connect with one another as women and so on. But somewhere like Rojava, you have millions of people, many of whom are very against this idea, because, it's like anywhere, a very patriarchal society, and these ideas, they're trying to implement, not only in the Kurdish regions where it was already difficult enough and met with a lot of opposition from conservative male figures in that society, but also in those regions that were the sort of former heartlands of ISIS. So trying to go to those communities and communicate those ideas in a way that made sense for the way that people were living in Syria was something that proved very difficult, met with a lot of kind of violent opposition, but that is the kind of model that they have been trying to introduce throughout this region called Rojava.
But they must have been pretty successful to get to the stage where they were governing, facilitating the self-governance of 5 million people. And I read that was a landmass the size of Lebanon. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, so the project, grew and became a lot bigger, but then in that growth then kind of created difficulties. Right. So it began in this sort of these relatively small, still quite large, but sort of Kurdish cities, Kurdish villages, and this project then was sort of welcomed, I suppose, by the Kurdish people as this opening, this chance to live in a way that they had wanted to live free from the domination of the centralized Arab state under Assad, and to start trying to put some of these ideas into practice in their own society. This was all, as I said, happening amid conditions of war, and sort of from the outset there was this fighting between especially the Kurds and Islamist factions in the Syrian opposition, who had a different view for how society should be governed, with both sides kind of seeking control on the ground. And that then sort of really became a sort of existential war with the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, who also entered Syria, also trying to implement a sort of radically new way of living, but one with a totally different conception, for example, of the role for women, also a very different conception of what should be the role of minorities such as the Kurds, but especially religious minorities such as Christians or Yazidis, seeing them as second-class citizens. And so these two forces came kind of head-to-head in Syria. And that was where this project really started to expand, because the Kurds started collaborating with the United States in this war against ISIS. They were the first force to defeat ISIS on the ground, 2014-15. And that then began this sort of quite unexpected collaboration between these Kurdish units in the United States. And I say unexpected because this Kurdish movement that we're talking about, was, and is an enlisted terrorist organization. They are considered terrorists, especially by Turkey, therefore also by the British government, by the European Union, and by the American government. But yet, because they were able and willing and capable to fight ISIS on the ground, they got this sort of backing from the United States at the same time. So it was a very, I suppose, sort of contradictory situation that they were getting this military support. They were getting backed by airstrikes against ISIS, but also the US was working in back channel ways to undermine this political project. As we're continuing to see until today. But what that kind of immediately meant was that this project was able to expand out, as I said, from these Kurdish regions into this larger and larger territory. So, for example, Raqqa, which was the capital of ISIS, was taken over by Kurdish-led but kind of multi-ethnic forces, Kurds and secular Arabs, working together. And they began to govern this much larger territory on the basis of these ideas. But that then contributed to some of the internal challenges, I think, that this project faced. Because, as I said, there was this idea, the idea is local communities should be able to govern themselves, have their own say in what they want to do. But, for example, what happens when that's what you believe and you go to the local community, you say, how do you want to run your affairs? And you say, well, we don't think there should be any women in public life, and we believe that our traditional tribal leaders should be the ones to continue doing that. And how do you respect that? If you don't respect that, you then sort of get into conflict with those local people, and that created a lot of tensions, a lot of difficulties. And I think this project came more and more to be seen by especially by these sort of very conservative or generally conservative Arab populations living under it, as this kind of Kurdish project for Kurdish interests, about Kurdish politics that didn't have anything to do with the way that they wanted to live. So that created some of the internal tensions and difficulties. At the same time, as this project was expanding, it was also being attacked. So as I said, the United States was sort of present for that fight against ISIS, and they were able to defeat ISIS. But Turkey was at the same time launching attacks against this region, because Turkey is especially opposed to any kind of Kurdish politics, Kurdish autonomy, given Turkey's own long-term occupation of Kurdistan. And so Turkey launched successive military operations against the region, which it was able to do with the US's blessing. And the region also suffered from sort of economic embargo, so it has no kind of recognized status, wasn't able to trade formally with the outside world, wasn't allowed to participate, for example, in official political negotiations at the United Nations, because it's not a state over Syria's future, whereas those sort of Islamist forces who were committing war crimes against the Kurds were allowed to participate. And so that kind of isolation, the fact these ongoing Turkish military campaigns, Turkish airstrikes, especially targeting the region's oil infrastructure, water infrastructure, grain infrastructure, and so on, really degraded the kind of humanitarian situation. There were also these big security problems, as I said, due to, I guess, a mix of insurgency from ISIS in particular, as well as other groups targeting this Kurdish administration, being sponsored by the many states as well that are opposed to this Kurdish-led project. Then this increasingly sort of tough security measures being imposed by the Kurdish-led authorities to try and keep control of that situation. So all of which is to say that this, as it got bigger and bigger, as you can imagine, this project met with more and more security threats from the outside. It also came under a lot of internal pressure to keep these ideas alive and to find ways to balance these different ideas they were trying to implement with one another and with the very difficult humanitarian and military situation on the ground.
Now, from what I understand, Rojava is relatively resource rich, a very resource rich area of Syria, which is known generally for its wealth that lies under its soil. Were the Kurds using the oil at all that they had access to, or not?
Yeah, it's another one of the, I suppose, interesting contradictions in how this project went on the ground. Um, in that, so in that, I suppose, another part of Kurdish movement's political vision, as well as this idea of direct democracy, this idea of women's autonomy, is these ideas that they take from, more ecological traditions of having a sort of rejuvenated relationship to the natural world. There involves a green movement. But what is the kind of reality on the ground? All of this that I've been talking about is funded through oil revenues,
Right.
and in the course of those operations against ISIS, the Kurdish forces were able to get control of pretty much all of Syria's oil, and they would then, and that was how they have since then been funding, all these efforts in, fundamentally, that's the money that they use to keep people in the region from starving,
Yeah.
and to fund the sort of national defense. And that's sort of is part of the reason why that region has had, compared to other parts of Syria, relatively high standards of sort of humanitarian provision. Still, life is difficult there, but it was better to live there than it was to live under Assad or to live under jihadist control elsewhere in Syria, up until the sort of more recent developments in Syria. And the region was kind of reliant on those oil revenues. It was mostly selling them within Syria, so just selling that oil, back to the Syrian government, to Assad, to other non-state armed forces in Syria, and selling some also like illegally across the border into neighboring Iraq. And that, I think, was again part of why they were able to achieve the successes they achieved. That is also no longer the case as part of the more recent developments on the ground. But I think that then also, of course, that economic reality coupled with the security situation meant, the administration was in this position, was getting this money and it was using it, one, to stop people from starving, to provide subsidized bread, subsidized diesel, and other sort of some basic like medical support to people living in those regions, and two, to sort of fund this asymmetrical war that it was fighting against, fighting against Turkey and fighting against other forces in the region. But that then meant it wasn't able, I think, to achieve at all really this ideological vision that they might have had, and that also meant that they weren't able to pursue some of these other projects, as fully as they wished, because they were always in this kind of military crisis situation and using their revenues for that purpose.
But in your opinion, do you think they could have survived at all if they didn't have the revenue generated from the oil fields?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
As a
I
political
think this
project, I
is,
mean.
yeah. And I think this is, for me, it's kind of, part of, the broader interest, like, I suppose, in this project is, if people speak about Rojava at all, in sort of, Western circles, it's sort of often held up as this kind of idealized project, right? And these brave women who fought ISIS, and they were able to create this kind of feminist zone where, where everything's wonderful and there's no state. But actually, the situation in lots of ways is more complicated than that. That, these women were able to lead the struggle, they were able to drive out ISIS, but that came with a lot of contradictions and compromises. Being forced to deal with those, to deal with the Assad state. They always had some degree of relations with the Assad government, even though they were opposed to it, making those sort of ideological compromises that I mentioned earlier. Running, what sort of, whether they liked it or not, increasingly did. It looked like a state, it felt like a state. If it was policed, there was a sort of difficult
really?
security situation. You can't drive, 2 kilometers without coming to a checkpoint. If those checkpoints weren't there, there would be, more killings, because, you're in northern Syria, right? But I think that kind of reality on the ground is a little bit different from what people might envisage if they have some idea of this project. But I don't think that, I think that's all for me anyway, that gave all the more reason to try and understand better, what was happening there. And if, people are thinking about, how do we pursue these maybe similar goals, right, of sort of autonomy, of not needing to rely on the state so much. But if you start thinking about those ideas in terms of a population of millions of people, as they had to in northern Syria, you then very quickly come into these compromises. How do we keep people alive? How do we fight off states who have tanks and who have warplanes and who are, ready and willing to kill us because of the struggle that we're engaged in? How do we deal with the fact that a large majority of the people that will govern maybe now never heard of these ideas we're talking about, or if they have heard of them, don't like them? And these the challenges I think that this project has been going through throughout the past throughout the past 15 years, and that have continued till the difficult moment it's in today.
It's making me think of the contradictions that are being presented to indigenous communities all over the world, whereby they are being offered the quote unquote opportunity to protect their territories and to retain stewardship of their territories if they allow mechanisms like carbon credits or biodiversity credits or ecotourism, or as long as they allow the market in some way. And sadly, for many of them, they are realizing that within a globalized economic system of capitalism, the market is always constantly trying to get in, and they are going to need some resources in order to be able to defend themselves. And so this sort of self-defense as self-determination also, as you've sort of laid out, becomes an equation of, yes, self-defense as self-determination, but in order to fund that defense within a globalized system and within also an environment of, particularly for the Kurds, what you're describing, an environment of violence and war that is occurring all around, there will inevitably have to be some level of exploitation that occurs somewhere so that we can get the funds that we need in order to advance this sort of idealistic vision.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, in many ways that what has happened in Syria is sort of offers a foretaste of, the directions that conflict and global politics will take in coming decades. That, in Syria, it was this situation of, there was a situation where the state kind of collapsed, but that didn't just mean everyone could start doing whatever they wanted. It meant a lot of other states entered and started trying to exploit the same territory and the same resources. It meant that people who hadn't been a state before had to start acting a lot more like a state if they wanted to survive. At some point there were hundreds of armed factions fighting in Syria. Now there are only really 2 or 3 left, and those who have survived are the ones who have been able to adapt to that reality, to act more pragmatically, to act more like a state, even if, as in the Kurdish case, they're ideologically opposed to that very idea. Syria, it's also a resource competition, and in order to create a space for those resources to be used at the least, what is kind of positive in the northeast, for those resources be used more equitably than they would have been under Assad. Nonetheless, it was necessary to seize those resources militarily, to defend them militarily, and those kind of challenges, I think, will repeat, and in conflicts of the future, not only about energy resources, also, of course, about water resources, and that has also been a factor of the conflict in northern Syria, like very heavy fighting over access to water pumping stations, and again, Turkey deliberately targeting especially water infrastructure, trying to seize control of it, put it out of service to contribute to the desertification of the region, to make life unlivable. Reducing the flow through the sort of rivers and the water pumping stations that it has access to. So, all of those kind of dimensions and the militarization of these issues, I think you'll see in elsewhere in the Middle East and the whole of Africa, in Central Africa, elsewhere in coming decades, and I think those sort of speak to some of the realities of the conflict. I think so the Syrian conflict, this kind of climate aspect, the desertification of Syria, the lack of water, hunger was a part of the conflict. I don't think it was the main reason for the conflict, but it was certainly a factor, and those dynamics are only going to increase and spread. And so I think, it's important to see what has kind of happened to that movement in Rojava in terms of its ecological aspirations and in terms of its other aspirations as well, when you're thinking about what might happen in other parts of the world.
You implied before that the way that Rojava is spoken about in Western circles can be a bit naive. What do you think the way that Rojava is characterized in these circles reveals about the tenacity or even viability of these protest or defense movements for the future in our part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I suppose the naive, maybe if there is a naivety to the way it's spoken about, I think that speaks to something very real and very serious, which is people's desire to believe that another world is possible. I think, that's something that, yeah, Rojava has given to a lot of people living, elsewhere in the world, the idea that, yes, it is possible for these ideas to be lived out. And that's especially true, I think, in terms of what it's given to women in the region and to women who, sort of internationalist women who are following that struggle, and that is something, very real and very sort of tangible, in which, if you travel there, you see on the ground, you feel from the moment you cross the border and you're welcomed by a woman, and, then you go through the checkpoint and the guards are women, and you go to, any meeting, you see the way in which young women speak and participate in politics with such a sort of naturalness that you'll not find, anywhere else, in the world, potentially, certainly not anywhere else in that region. And these are very real things, and I think people have, a need and a desire to see that another world is possible, and I think it's important that Rojava is able to contribute to that. But then I also think, part of that engagement, part of that learning process is some of these things that I've been talking about. The Kurdish movement sees itself also as an internationalist movement, and it, has always invited people to engage with what it's trying to do, to see what it's trying to do, to visit the region, when that's possible, for journalists, but also for people on the left to go there, to spend time there, to learn the way that things work, to think about some of these issues that I've been speaking about. And they're also clear, I think, that the way things have gone in Kurdistan, the way they've tried to achieve these goals there, doesn't mean that things can be done in the same way in Britain, for example, or, even elsewhere in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
But, one can think about the way that things have done there and how they're able to achieve those successes they have achieved, and to discuss with with the people there, the people who have lived through this kind of total transformation in the way they live, and then to start thinking about it internationally. And I mean, of course, I don't think the Kurdish movement is the only movement that gives people internationally that kind of hope, that kind of belief that maybe something bigger in themselves is possible. I think what's distinctive about it is that they have this concrete program that they're putting forward, which is something new. There are other people resisting and fighting in Palestine and in Sudan, and all over the region. What's sort of distinctive in this Rojava project is that they're saying we have this alternate idea of how we want to live, and we're sort of putting that forward onto the table. And I think it's then important to begin this conversation of thinking about that, questioning that, seeing how it works, and asking what might happen in the future. And I mean, I think this movement is it sort of had this kind of moment, I suppose, of being in broad public attention in the time of this Kurdish war against ISIS. People are probably less aware, I think, that they have remained to this day fighting for those principles and ideals, and sort of going beyond the headlines and trying to build these ideas, from the grassroots up in local communities in Syria. But also I think people are unaware maybe of the compromises and challenges that process has faced.
And but I would like to know, do you think that it is necessary for liberation movements all around the world to grasp the probably requisite compromises and contradictions that may occur for them in the future in order to perhaps be more successful?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's what Gramsci would call a pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? That the two kind of go together. And then, yes, in my book about sort of, how the left can engage with Rojava, and especially what it can teach us about hope and how to hope in hopeless times. I think that this is something I talk about, that the idea of these two ideas are actually interrelated. So, as I kind of saw in Rojava on the ground, that it was the fact that people had this belief in something bigger than them. They had a belief in this ideal, this vision that they'd been given that was something so big and such a total transformation. That vision was what justified them to be involved in this more sort of nitty-gritty day-to-day stuff. It was, the fact of knowing that's what they were fighting for that enabled them to, for example, sort of female activists to go and sit down with the very conservative tribal leaders and have discussions in which they probably felt very disrespected, for example, but they were able to do that because they knew that was in the service of this thing they were fighting for. Like, I think the fact the fact of having that goal is also what motivates people to sacrifice their lives to engage in that armed struggle there, because that was kind of the context on the ground, but also to be involved in this more sort of boring day-to-day tasks, the sort of the local administration figuring out how we're gonna kind of meet this humanitarian need, how we're going to decide whose road gets fixed first. I don't know, whatever these sort of small sort of things, small compromises, big compromises might be, it was always done with this bigger vision in mind. And so I think, because they had that big vision, they were more willing to do this kind of practical stuff. Whereas it can be that for movements where we have, less of a sort of dream or clear sort of common vision in mind, it then becomes easy for us to spend more of our time, as I do here in Britain, talking about these things, thinking about these things, rather than sort of taking these small steps that lead toward that bigger goal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose I'm in particularly thinking about the contradiction of being a green movement that is forced to use oil fields in order to advance a political project, and the bigger that political project gets, the more opportunity they will have in future to formalize their green vision. Like that's the kind of contradiction really that interests me, because I think that I think they made the right decision personally to use to exploit that oil. I think that it's not just the burning of fossil fuels that is important, but the intention and who it's benefiting, right? We could use far less fossil fuels around the world tomorrow if we stopped lining the pockets of the mega rich with burning these hydrocarbons. So that's something that's sort of particularly interesting, where sort of the morality and the practicality and then the wider vision all sort of come into play together and create perhaps surprising results, but results nonetheless that are important.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so what sort of, if you were to speak to Kurdish people that are involved in the environmental activists in Rojava, what they would say is we're living under conditions of occupation, colonial occupation. These are the resources that we have.
Yep.
We have no choice but to use them. If we weren't using them, I mean, the occupying states would be using them. And if we were sort of granted the status we're looking for and allowed to engage with global markets, we would then be in a position to diversify our economy away from oil. I think there's truth to that, certainly in terms of, the exploitation of those resources. Then, I think that's just, if they weren't using them, someone else would be. And so, I think it's not a sort of morally compromising thing that they're doing in making use of those financial resources. I think what you also see, though, in Rojava is that often it's the crisis. It's when there's a crisis that's kind of met with the sort of response. When there's a need, that need is met, and it's rather than people sort of ideologically choosing to not use resources and leave them in the ground, it's more when they're sort of pushed to do so. And you see that, I guess, like in lots of ways there, also in other political mechanisms, but, in terms of energy, the fact that those oil resources were being targeted by Turkey, subjected to airstrikes, meant that increasingly people in the region are reliant on solar power. And that, is, I don't know, it's not something that I think you can go to people and say, you should use this because it's better for the environment, because people are just trying to stop their babies from freezing to death, but at the same time, it's, so there's this kind of, like, you can think of as kind of crisis socialism, that in the same way, when people are being subjected to this intense pressure, it's when there are these moments of solidarity, people are helping their neighbors, people are trying to govern their own communities. And that, again, I think is something that happens the world over, in difficult situations, people come together and they help one another out. So I think you can also see these dynamics at play of people sort of being pushed to these solutions, not because they're told to do so by a political movement, but because they're the most practical way to survive. And so I think what that then, what that means for what that would encourage in terms of the climate movement, which is not, a movement that I am so directly involved with, but I think, what that encourages, is this approach of identifying people's needs, seeing how they can meet it, who are the people on the front lines of climate crisis whose lives can be transformed by these technologies, not just because they think it's a good thing to do to sort their garbage, but because they need these renewable energy resources and approaches in order to survive, for example. And though I suppose those are the kind of points that I think it's interesting to think about in terms of the Rojava Revolution. Probably people involved in the climate movement, for example, be able to, think that through more fully. But that kind of, I suppose, pragmatic approach really to politics and understanding people's everyday lives and everyday needs, and not kind of trying to impose things on them from the outside in a moralistic way, is when I think things have been more effective in Rojava. Whereas when they have tried to, because they also at the same time, they have a lot of, I guess, they do a lot of campaigns around, the pre-planting campaigns and encouraging people not to litter and this kind of stuff. And they devote a lot of energy to that, but I don't think that, that hasn't made much difference on the ground, because people are not really focused on these things. They're just trying to survive in Syria, right? And it's more these pragmatic things that have made the bigger impact.
Now, before I have to let you go, the situation in Syria has changed quite dramatically in the past year and in the past month. Could you talk us through what is happening in Rojava and to this autonomous zone since Assad's government fell?
Yeah, that's right. So I guess Syria had been out of the news for a while, and probably still is out for most people's news feeds, but there have been some very big changes in the past year. So I think the latest changes are really part of the changes in the Middle East since the beginning of the Gaza genocide in 2023. And so because of that, Israel has been much more active throughout the Middle East in trying to take out the sort of forces that in the Middle East that are allied with Iran and opposed to Israel. So that means Israel has been attacking the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, Israel has been attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it meant also Israel and the United States have been working to see the end of Assad, because, Assad was a key ally of Iran, and they were able to achieve that goal a little bit over a year ago. So there had been this kind of frozen conflict in Syria. It was divided, between this Kurdish zone, between the Assad government, and the zones sort of controlled by these Islamist militias, of which the main one is a force called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was originally sort of an al-Qaeda affiliate, but since broken with al-Qaeda and now operates as a Syrian Islamist force. And they, with some degree of coordination with the Israelis and with Turkey and with the United States, were able to launch this operation and very quickly kick out Assad and take control of all the rest of Syria, apart from this Kurdish-controlled zone, which, as I said, was these Kurdish cities, but also this larger region of Arab communities, those that had formerly been living under ISIS. And so that then tipped the balance of power in Syria. I think, one of the lessons, there in Rojava was that they had been able to survive so long by kind of playing these powers off against one another, by playing Turkey and Israel off against one another, by playing the United States and Russia off against one another, like all of whom had their own reasons for being in Syria and were sort of seeking to exert pressure on the ground. And this Kurdish project survived due to those tensions. But now that's a difficult way to survive for a long time. And now there's a new kind of order developing in the Middle East aligned against Iran. There is now a new government in Damascus. There is more open to business with the Americans, ready to do what they want in terms of following Israel's interests and joining that potential broader regional conflict. So there was not really any need anymore for the United States to keep this weird relationship that it had with the Kurds. So the US and Israel said to the new Syrian government, okay, you can go ahead, you can attack Rojava, as they, obviously this Islamist force wants to get control of the whole of Syria. So this January, I was back in the region, I was there on the ground, and there was this offensive, as I say, kind of green-led by the United States, green-led by Israel, and also done with Turkey's full support by this new Islamist government in Damascus to advance against Rojava. They were able to very rapidly seize a lot of that territory and really sort of squeeze this project back down to how it began. So sort of has ended up now with government armed forces, backed by all of the Western powers really around these small isolated Kurdish settlements. The loss of those oil was also spoken about earlier. At the same time, what that has come with is these big kind of Arab regions, Raqqa, leaving this kind of Kurdish control. And I think a lot of people there were quite happy about that. They didn't want to be living under this Kurdish project. They would rather live under this new Arab, maybe more Islamist government under this also internationally recognized centralized Syrian government. And that has now left the administration, the Kurdish-led administration, in a difficult spot. They are still kind of in negotiations. There's now like a ceasefire, and they're sort of trying to see, I suppose, what can be preserved from this project, both materially in terms of how much military autonomy will they be able to preserve, how much their economic autonomy will they be able to preserve, will they still be able to have their own border crossings, these kind of questions, but also ideologically, will they still be able to keep governing their own cities in the way that they want? Will their women be allowed to keep having this prominent role in public life? Will their all-female armed forces be allowed to continue to exist? And these are all the sort of points that are under negotiation. It's not completely clear really on any of these points. There are going to have to be changes. There are going to have to be various compromises and deals between these two forces. But that is the challenge that this project, the Rojava Revolution, is now facing.
My God, how terrible! What do you think its sort of chances of survival are?
I mean, I think, when I was as I say, when I was there, sort of one thing that was very clear was that, especially for women and also for the Kurdish people, this was an existential question, and I was with a lot of, friends of mine, young women who've grown, it's all they've ever known is this system, they've grown up in it. They don't remember living under Assad. They don't remember not having this prominent place in public life. So for them, it's an absolute red line that, they will not, allow this takeover. And I think also for the Kurdish people, again, sort of people who've got used to living in with this sort of Kurdish autonomy, and I think they will not accept, and they will be ready to fight against the government forces. And it was, somehow like some of those nights I was there, when people were taking to the streets, with their weapons, old women, young people sort of flooding out and saying we're going to defend this project. It was somehow the most excited I'd seen people in all the years that I'd been traveling to the region, living there. But, also I think that comes with that sort of sentiment comes with, a difficult side, and it's sort of reverted back to, just this sort of more, some of these ideas we're talking about this idea of cooperating between different communities, I think have been lost a bit in that process. It's now just more about preserving Kurdish rights, Kurdish autonomy, a sort of some kind of special status for them and their people. I think that's probably a reasonable thing for them to want at this point, but it's not really this vision that they had been fighting for all along. As to what will be preserved, I think there will be something. There will be some degree, certainly, of Kurdish autonomy in the northeast of Syria, not perhaps to the scale that they had envisaged, but sort of something very much more than what they had before. But the regional situation is very volatile, and on the one hand, that military operation there can continue, could wipe it out completely. On the other hand, there may be openings elsewhere, for example, in Iran, for this Kurdish movement to continue its struggle, potentially on an even bigger scale than before. And I just think, fundamentally, in terms of these ideas, especially for women, is that even if there is this full military takeover, even if everyone's driven back underground, it's a movement which is used to operating underground, which has done so for a very long time. And these ideas, can't be put back in the box. They're out there, sort of spread. People have, women have a belief in their ability to govern their own affairs. And that, I think, will continue. But in terms of the military situation on the ground, then yes, it is very difficult right now.
Is there anything that anyone who is listening can do to support from afar?
I mean, I think, yeah, and get like engagement with what's happening there, like is very it's very important because there's, I think, yeah, a lack of understanding of these ideas. So finding and what's happening on the ground, because it's very difficult, I think, to find information about what's happening there. So certainly finding resources to read about that. I would recommend the Almargi news website, which kind of reports from that, and they do very good work. For example, organization that I was involved in before, also the Rojava Information Center, post good updates about what's happening on the ground. More than that, I think engagement with these ideas, in left-wing spaces, ecological spaces, I think is very important. There are also concrete ways, of course, to support what's happening out there by supporting the Kurdish Red Crescent. In the UK, you can look up the Kurdistan Solidarity Network, and they have resources for contacting your MP, getting involved in protests and all that kind of thing. But I think the most important thing really is also just to, I think it's very important to me what's happening there is raised, not just as a sort of humanitarian issue that, people should be aware of, because of course, there's a lot of suffering going on everywhere in the world and elsewhere in the Middle East, but also because of these ideas and what they might mean and how they've developed. And I think that kind of critical engagement is always very important and very appreciated as well, by the people there who are trying to make these ideas a reality in such difficult circumstances.
Matt, thank you so much for this. This has been so informative and enlightening. I'm really, really grateful for your time. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I mean, there could be a number of people. I think, in terms of the ideas I've been talking about, I would maybe recommend someone called Dila Derek. She's Kurdish female academic based in the UK. And she has a book called The Kurdish Women's Movement in History, Theory, Practice. Because I think as much as, I talk about these ideas, I'm not from there. I'm not part of that women's movement. So I also maybe have a different perspective, I think, on some of these developments. And I think Dila, writes from a place of deep knowledge within that women's movement and about what makes that movement so unique and so special. And I think that's the number one thing maybe that this movement can contribute to the rest of the world. So she would be someone that would be great to speak to get a deeper understanding of that movement, where it came from and what it's trying to do.
Wonderful. I will reach out to her. Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at www.planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.